The blizzard raged, engulfing the Oregon wilderness in a blanket of white. Amidst the tempest, a wounded veteran pursued the tracks of an unusual canine. The German shepherd was not aimlessly wandering. It moved with unwavering determination, guiding him to the foot of a sheer granite precipice, a complete dead end. Yet the dog then accomplished the extraordinary. It employed its paw, pressing with conviction upon a stone indistinguishable from the others. A faint click resonated, followed by a low hum emanating from the mountain's depths. A faint fissure of light appeared on the rock face before a colossal steel portal began to slide open, revealing a state-of-the-art bunker. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind seemed alive, a predator clawing at the edges of the small cabin with a desperate, hungry sound. Each gust vibrated the single pane of glass in the window. The tremor produced a low hum that permeated Jake's very being. Outside, the world had ceased to exist, consumed by a swirling vortex of white. The inaugural severe blizzard of the Oregon winter had descended upon the Cascades with judgmental ferocity, burying the forest, the peaks, and the memory of sunlight beneath a thick, suffocating shroud. Inside, the cold was equally unforgiving. It was a damp, pervasive chill that the feeble flames in the stone fireplace were incapable of vanquishing. It clung to the roughly hewn wooden walls and deepened the shadows, a constant reminder of the encroaching decay both externally and internally. This cabin was not a dwelling. It was a redoubt, a sanctuary from a reality that had lost its coherence, a world where he no longer belonged. For 7 years since his honorable discharge, this had constituted his entire existence. 7 years of observing the passage of seasons through that single grimy window. 7 years of silence, punctuated solely by the wind's roar and the specters of memory. Jacob Thorne, universally known as Jake, sat at a small scuffed table in the room's center. At 40 years of age, the man he was meant to be had been eroded, leaving behind this gaunt, hardened stranger. His physique was tall and lean, retaining the powerful musculature from his former life as an army ranger, now diminished by neglect. Yet the latent strength remained, coiled and dormant beneath the surface. His brown hair, cropped short as a matter of habit, was streaked with gray at the temples, a stark contrast to the dark, untamed beard that obscured a jaw perpetually set in a line of tension. His face bore the marks of hardship, but his eyes, a deep and weary blue, held the faint glimmer of a kindness long since extinguished. He wore a faded red and black flannel shirt over a gray thermal, the fabric thin and frayed at the cuffs. His gaze was fixed upon a solitary piece of paper on the table, its crisp whiteness an affront to the room's gloom. It was an official communiqué, cold and impersonal, a notice of foreclosure. He had perused the words a dozen times, yet they still felt alien, a language from a life he was no longer a part of. Notice of default, failure to remit, immediate eviction. The phrases were clinical, sterile blades severing his last tether to the civilized world. This flimsy cabin, this final bulwark against the wilderness and his own psyche, was no longer his. It represented the ultimate pathetic failure in a long, unbroken sequence of them. He had failed to reintegrate. He had failed to maintain employment. He had failed to keep the night tuitions at bay. And now, he had failed even to retain a roof over his head. A bitter, silent laugh caught in his throat. He thought of Leo. He invariably thought of Leo during such moments, when the silence became too overwhelming. He could almost hear his voice, the easy laughter capable of dissipating the thickest tension. "Come on, Jake," Leo would invariably say, a grin spreading across his face. "You worry too much. We always find a way." But Leo was absent. Leo had found his way to a dusty grave in the Afghan mountains in 2018, on a mission gone catastrophically wrong with alarming speed. And Jake, the shield, the protector, had been unable to prevent it. He had brought his body home, but he had left his soul behind in that sun-scorched valley, alongside his comrade in arms. This foreclosure notice was not merely about a dwelling. It was the definitive verdict on his existence since Leo's demise. guilty of failure, sentenced to oblivion. Miles away, in the quaint, orderly town of Pine Ridge, nestled at the mountain's base, the blizzard was equally formidable. However, the atmosphere felt distinct. Here, warm lights illuminated windows, and the promise of community prevailed. In a small, impeccably maintained residence on the town's periphery, an elderly man observed the storm. Samuel Croft, in his late 70s, was a wiry, resilient individual, with a countenance as weathered as aged leather, and eyes that held the quiet, vigilant patience of one who had witnessed more than his fair share of the world's adversities. A veteran of a different, more arduous conflict, he recognized the irrefutable finality of a storm of this magnitude. He glanced from the window to a calendar affixed to the wall. The date was encircled in red. He then retrieved a worn, leather-bound journal from a drawer, turning to the final entry, penned in a familiar, confident script. The instructions were unambiguous, committed to memory years prior, yet reviewed out of routine. If you learn the bank is seizing the property, or if a storm descends that could permanently isolate him, the time has arrived. Do not delay. Samuel sighed, a puff of breath misting in the room's cool air. He walked to the rear door and opened it. Reclining on a thick rug, a magnificent dog lifted its head. It was a German shepherd, 10 years of age, with a dense coat of silver gray and white that suggested a noble lineage. Its physique was that of a seasoned athlete, powerful and scarred, its movements measured and assured, but it was its eyes that commanded attention. They were a startlingly intelligent shade of amber, regarding Samuel not with the simple affection of a pet, but with the calm, perceptive gaze of a partner. This was Kaiser. "Well, old friend," Samuel said softly, his voice raspy with age, "the time has come. You know where to go. You know who to find." Kaiser rose to his feet, a soft whine rumbling in his chest, a sound of understanding, not resistance. He nudged his head against the old man's hand. Samuel administered a final, firm scratch behind his ear. Quote, with a final look, Kaiser turned and stepped into the tempestuous blizzard. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. Lowering his head against the wind, his paws finding purchase in the rapidly deepening snow, he commenced his journey, a gray and white specter, moving with resolute purpose into the heart of the storm. An hour later, Jake remained seated at the table, the letter now a crumpled mass in his fist. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the cabin was nearly entirely dark. The wind howled, and within its roar he could discern the reverberations of gunfire, of shouted commands, of Leo's final sharp outcry. He closed his eyes. It would be exceedingly simple to simply step outside into the white expanse, to lie down, and surrender to the cold. An end to his failures, an end to his memories. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound at the door. He dismissed it as a branch or the wind playing tricks, but it recurred, more insistent this time, followed by a low, pained whine that was almost lost in the gale. Every instinct, long buried beneath layers of grief and apathy, cried out to him. Something living was outside, something in distress. With a groan he forced himself to his feet, his joints aching from the cold. He unlatched the heavy door, pulling it inward against the wind's force. A blast of snow and icy air filled the room, and there, partially collapsed on his doorstep, was the German shepherd. It was coated in ice and snow, shivering uncontrollably, one of its paws held limply off the ground. Yet, even in its exhaustion, its amber eyes met his, and they held a striking, unwavering intensity. Jake's training took over. He reached down without a second thought, his hands gripping the dog's thick coat, and hauled the heavy animal inside, slamming the door shut against the storm. The dog, Kaiser, collapsed onto the floor, breathing in ragged gasps. Jake knelt beside him, his hands expertly assessing for injuries. That's when he noticed it. The collar. It was not a commercially produced leather or nylon collar. It was fashioned from olive drab paracord, intricately woven into a thick king cobra knot. His breath hitched. It was their unit's hallmark, something they all crafted during downtime on deployment. A small token of shared identity. He had not encountered one in 7 years. His fingers traced the familiar pattern, and then he looked, truly looked, at the dog. This was not merely some stray that had lost its way. The exhaustion was evident, but beneath it lay a profound reservoir of strength and an unnerving intelligence. The dog met his gaze, and in that instant, the world stilled. The wind, the cold, the foreclosure notice. It all receded. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random act of nature. This was a dispatch from the past. This was Leo's ghost, incarnate in fur and loyalty, resting on his floor. And for the first time in a prolonged period, Jacob Thorne experienced something other than despair. He felt purpose. The silence within the cabin was a novel sensation. For 7 years, silence had been an empty, aching void. Now it was a palpable, charged presence, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of a spirit. The storm continued its fury outside, a muted symphony of shrieking wind and rattling ice. But inside, the world had contracted to the space between a broken man and a dog dispatched from bygone days. Jake knelt on the floor, his fingers still resting on the rough, familiar weave of the paracord collar. Kaiser, the German shepherd, lay on the floor, his breathing evening out as the cabin's warmth began to dispel the deep chill from his bones. He had lapped a bowl of water Jake had offered, a purely practical gesture, and then settled, his amber eyes never deviating from Jake's face. They conveyed no plea or fear. They possessed a vigilance, a patience, and an intelligence that was profoundly unsettling. This was implausible. Dogs were not accustomed to carrying messages. The deceased did not dispatch emissaries. Every rational inclination within Jake's mind, the part that had successfully navigated the turmoil of war and the gradual erosion of sorrow, insisted this was a mere coincidence. A stray canine, a familiar echo from a bygone era, a desperate consciousness fabricating connections where none existed. It was more palatable to accept delusion than to embrace the miraculous. Yet his primal instincts, those sharpened during his service in the mountains of Afghanistan, told a different narrative. They recognized the composed demeanor of an animal trained to endure extreme duress. They perceived the deliberate intent within those unwavering eyes, and felt the insurmountable gravity of Leo's final wishes bearing down upon him. Leo, the meticulous planner, the strategist, who invariably devised 3 contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. Could this be his final, most improbable failsafe? The internal conflict consumed Jake for extended minutes. To remain meant succumbing to the inevitable, allowing the foreclosure notice to serve as the ultimate conclusion to his narrative. To permit the snow to accumulate until the entryway became impassable, to let the embers in the hearth extinguish, mirroring the cessation of spirit within him. This was the facile route, the one he had been traversing for 7 long years. To depart, to follow this dog, meant re-engaging with a world of missions and objectives, a realm of suffering and purpose he had striven so arduously to leave behind. It represented an act of faith, a currency of which he had been depleted long ago. As if sensing this pivotal juncture, Kaiser stirred. With a low intone, he propelled himself upwards, first onto his forelimbs, then rising to his full, imposing stature. He shook his dense coat, dislodging a flurry of melted snow across the floorboards. He still exhibited fatigue, his movements stiff from the cold, but this weariness was secondary to his objective. He ambled purposefully toward the door, the very portal at which he had collapsed mere moments prior. He neither scratched nor whimpered. He simply positioned himself before it, glanced over his shoulder at Jake, and awaited. The summons was unambiguous, unspoken, absolute. In that instant, the soldier within Jake awakened. He did not make a deliberate choice. His body moved autonomously, an apparatus meticulously maintained and left to deteriorate, yet not entirely rendered inoperable. He stood, his joints creaking in protest, and proceeded to the corner, where his antiquated equipment reposed. He donned a heavy, insulated parka, its fabric worn and stained, yet still serviceable. He fitted his feet into stout, waterproof footwear. He retrieved his rucksack, inspecting its contents with an efficiency born of ingrained habit. A blade, a fire-starting implement, a compact first aid kit, a water flask. It was the spectral remnant of a life previously held, and it settled upon his shoulders with a familiar weight. He grasped the crumpled foreclosure notice from the table and cast it into the dying embers of the fire. The paper buckled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. A final judgment, rescinded. Jake unlatched the door, and the tempest greeted them with a physical force. Kaiser ventured into the white chaos without hesitation. Jake tightened his hood, leaned into the gale, and followed suit. The external environment beyond the cabin was utter pandemonium. The snow constituted a blinding, horizontal assault, and the wind assailed any exposed flesh with icy tenacity. Visibility was less than 10 feet. For any ordinary individual or domesticated creature, progression would have been impossible, an act of suicidal folly. However, Kaiser was not an ordinary animal. He did not bound through the snow. He navigated with a deliberate, energy-conserving gait. He guided Jake away from the faint indication of the path leading to the cabin and plunged into the dense woodland, utilizing the colossal trunks of ancient firs and cedars as a bulwark against the wind. Jake, an adept tracker and survivalist, immediately comprehended the strategic intelligence behind their chosen route. The canine was not opting for the path of least resistance. He was selecting the route of minimal visibility. He maintained proximity to the ground, following the land's contours in a manner that would conceal them from observation from any elevated vantage point. He circumvented open clearings, opting to traverse dense, formidable undergrowth rather than expose themselves, even momentarily. He directed Jake across a frozen waterway at its most constricted and sheltered location. Every turn, every decision, bespoke strategic deliberation. This was an infiltration route of military design, not a casual deer track. As they advanced, the hours dissolving into an indistinguishable white expanse, an internal alteration began to manifest within Jake. The oppressive, stifling shroud of his depression, the incessant, dull throb of his grief, started to recede. It was supplanted by a frigid, acute clarity. His faculties, long dormant, were reawakened. He noted the wind's direction, the snow's depth, the stability of the terrain beneath his feet. His physique, which had felt like an encumbrance for years, now responded with grim, familiar efficacy. He was no longer a man awaiting his demise. He was an operative engaged in a mission. The objective remained unknown, yet he placed his trust implicitly in his guide. He observed Kaiser, filled with astonishment. The dog moved with an unwavering conviction, periodically pausing to glance back, ensuring Jake remained in proximity, his amber eyes ablaze against the snow. He served as a compass, a guide, a silent commander leading a two-man detachment through hostile territory. Ultimately, after what felt like an age, Kaiser reduced his pace. They had reached the base of a colossal granite precipice, a sheer stone facade that ascended into the swirling snow, vanishing from sight. It represented a dead end, a locus where the forest abruptly concluded. A small alcove at its foundation offered some respite from the unyielding wind, and Kaiser led Jake into it. Jake leaned against the frigid rock, his exhalations forming clouds in the air, his muscles protesting vehemently. "All right, Leo," he whispered to the wind. "What now?" Kaiser did not pause. He traversed the cliff's base, his olfactory senses intently engaged. He halted at a segment that bore no distinction from the surrounding rock, a flat, unremarkable stone surface. He inhaled deeply at a specific point near the ground, then regorded Jake. He emitted a singular breath, a sharp, purposeful sound. Subsequently, he elevated his right paw and pressed it firmly against a particular stone. The rock appeared no different from any other, but beneath the pressure of Kaiser's paw, it yielded slightly with a subtle click. For a moment, nothing transpired. Then, a low resonance vibrated through the soles of Jake's boots. A profound mechanical thrum that felt incongruous within the wilderness's core. A slender, immaculate line of luminescence materialized in the rock face, delineating the outline of a substantial rectangle. With a nearly silent hiss of hydraulics, the immense granite section receded inward, revealing not a cavern, but a robust, reinforced steel portal commensurate with a bank vault's security. The portal unsealed, projecting a clean, warm golden illumination into the raging blizzard. It disclosed a contemporary, uncluttered corridor, a stark contrast to the untamed, chaotic environment beyond. Jake gazed, his intellect struggling to comprehend the visual input. The storm raged behind him, a world of chaos and mortality. Before him lay an entryway to an improbable secret, and at its threshold, looking back as if to inquire, quote, "2, stood the canine, Leo's dog." The heavy steel portal slid shut behind them with a quiet, decisive hiss, the sound of a vault being secured. The tempest's roar was abruptly severed, replaced by a profound resonant silence. The interior atmosphere was cool, arid, and carried a faint aroma of ozone and filtered air, a scent so pure it felt alien after the raw, wild exhalations of the mountains. Jake stood, his eyes adjusting to the warm, steady luminescence of the corridor, his mind attempting to bridge the chasm between the tempestuous, primitive world he had just departed and the sterile, technologically advanced environment he had penetrated. Kaiser, the German shepherd, dislodged the last vestiges of snow from his coat and looked up at Jake, then emitted a soft bark and trotted confidently down the corridor. His paws made no sound on the smooth metallic flooring. Following a moment of stunned hesitation, Jake complied. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber, serving as the facility's nucleus. It was a space engineered for utility rather than comfort. A straightforward, military-style cot was integrated into one wall, its gray blanket folded with immaculate precision. A compact, efficient kitchenette, featuring stainless steel surfaces, occupied another corner. However, the predominant feature of the room was the operational hub. It was an impressive configuration, a semicircular arrangement of screens, keyboards, and equipment that appeared to be military-grade communication apparatus, all centered around a substantial primary display. A solitary server rack emitted a quiet hum nearby. Its intermittently flashing green and amber lights were the sole indication of the immense power contained within. This was Leo's domain, the realm of data, strategy, and concealed information. Kaiser led Jake directly to the ergonomic chair positioned before the console, and then reclined at its base, its directive as a guide seemingly fulfilled. It rested its head upon its paws, its amber eyes fixated on Jake, awaiting. Inhaling deeply, Jake settled into the chair. It felt peculiar to be seated at a desk after 7 years spent evading any semblance of structured existence. He depressed a key, and the main monitor illuminated. It displayed not a welcoming interface, but a stream of error notifications. Directory not found. Master file table corrupted. Critical system failure. A deluge of despair washed over Jake. He had followed this spectral canine through a blizzard only to encounter a dead end, a malfunctioning computer. But then he detected a single blinking cursor in the upper left quadrant of the screen. A command prompt. It represented an clandestine entry point, a pathway for an individual possessing the requisite knowledge. Some of his ranger training had encompassed signals intelligence and fundamental field data retrieval. Years had elapsed, yet the knowledge remained, deeply ingrained. With a grim resolve, Jake's fingers found the keyboard. The undertaking was slow, meticulously executed. He was not merely recovering files. He was performing digital archaeology. He circumvented the compromised operating system, accessing the raw data housed within the drives. He discovered fragmented pieces of a puzzle, shattered by what must have been a safety protocol designed to erase the system. It appeared Leo had anticipated every scenario, besides outright victory. The initial file he managed to retrieve was a brief, low-quality video without audio. It depicted several men in plain, unmarked uniforms interacting with individuals Jake immediately identified as high-ranking insurgents, exchanging a briefcase. The setting was clearly the same Afghan territory where his unit had been deployed. Following this, he reconstructed a heavily garbled audio recording. Leo's voice, muffled by static, sounded strained. The intel inconsistencies are too frequent. Apex Solutions is providing us with flawed information. I'm certain of it. Their private convoy timings align with surges in enemy activity. It's not a coincidence. I need to investigate further. Quote. Jake. Quote. 1. If you're viewing this, then I was correct, and I apologize. I am truly sorry I had to involve you in this. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It's Apex. They're corrupt. They've been manipulating both sides for years, profiting from our losses. I've found the evidence, Jake. The financial records, the communications. It's all here on these drives. I've hidden it as best I could. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. They know I'm close. This upcoming deployment, the one we're leaving for tomorrow, it's a trap. I know it is. They intend to eliminate us and make it appear as hostile action. They aim to silence me permanently. Tears welled in Jake's eyes, sharp and hot. He had attributed it to bad fortune, a mission gone awry, but it was a deliberate execution, an ambush. I have to go, Leo continued, his tone hardening. If I withdraw now, they'll realize for sure, and they'll come after both of us. This is the only way. At least this way, I can ensure I'm there to cover you when things go wrong. Quote. 2. Look after Kaiser for me, will you? Quote. 3. He's more intelligent than most people I know. He'll get you here. The access mechanism is tied to a pressure plate. Only he knows. He's my last resort, my ghost in the system. He looked back towards the camera, directly at Jake, a wistful smile touching his lips. You were always the superior soldier, Jake. The shield. I was merely the one who guided you. So I'm guiding you one last time. Finish this for me. For all the comrades we lost because of them. I know you can. I always have. The screen went black. Jake sat in the low hum of the bunker, his best friend's final words resonating in the sterile environment. The grief that had hollowed him out for 7 years remained. But now, it was accompanied by something else. A cold, pure, clarifying rage. His guilt had been toxic, convincing him he had failed to protect his friend. However, the truth was far more egregious. Leo had not been a casualty of war. He had been a sacrifice, murdered. He looked down at Kaiser. The old dog had raised his head and was watching him, his amber eyes reflecting a sorrowful, ancient wisdom. The mission was no longer an enigma. The legacy was no longer a question. It was a burden, a responsibility, an honor. It was a promise to a departed comrade. And Jacob Thorne was a man who honored his commitments. The darkness that descended after Leo's final message was more profound than the preceding silence. It was a darkness imbued with truth and deception. A void where 7 years of misdirected guilt had been violently excised, leaving behind the raw, burning wound of a murdered man's vengeance. Jake remained motionless, the monitor's glow casting stark shadows on his face, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk's edge. Kaiser, the German shepherd, emitted a soft whine from the floor, sensing the tempest brewing within the man. He nudged his head against Jake's leg, a silent, stabilizing presence. The contact broke the spell. Jake took a ragged breath, the air a painful rasp in his lungs. The soldier, the operative, long dormant, assumed control. Grief was a luxury, rage was fuel. But purpose demanded a strategy, and a strategy required intelligence. He needed to comprehend this place, this legacy, this stronghold. With renewed determination, he stood. His immediate priority was a comprehensive tactical assessment. He needed to understand the layout, the capabilities, and the vulnerabilities of his new command center. Kaiser padded silently at his heels, a gray silhouette following as he commenced a methodical exploration. The central chamber was the core, but several corridors branched out from it. He discovered a compact, functional bathroom with a water recycling shower. He located a storage pantry stocked with enough non-perishable food and medical supplies to last for years. Everything was vacuum-sealed, organized and labeled in Leo's precise military-style handwriting. Every detail bespoke meticulous, long-term planning. Returning to the main operations room, he approached the computer. Tucked away in an uncorrupted sector of the server was a folder named Facility. It was protected, but the password hint was a single question. "Where we first met?" Jake offered a grim smile. "Fort Benning." He typed in the name of the training base, and the folder unlocked. It contained a wealth of documents. The initial files he opened were scanned copies of aged, yellowed blueprints. The letterhead was official, bearing the insignia of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, dated 1961. The title read, "Continuity of Government Communications Relay Station, Cascade Sector." It all fell into place. This was not merely a prepper's bunker, it was a decommissioned Cold War relic, a fortified node in a network designed to ensure governmental continuity after a nuclear war. It was constructed to be undetectable, impenetrable, and entirely self-sufficient. Deeper within the folder, he uncovered more recent documents. A bill of sale from the General Services Administration, dated 10 years prior, transferring ownership of the abandoned Geological Survey outpost to a shell corporation Jake had never encountered. And behind that corporation, a single purchasing agent, Leo Vance. A fresh wave of astonishment washed over Jake. Leo hadn't simply constructed a hideout. He had acquired a piece of forgotten military infrastructure, a spectral remnant of the past, and painstakingly revitalized it. He had dedicated years to transforming this forgotten tomb into a sanctuary. Following the original schematics, Jake located a door marked, "Dro." Inside, the low hum he had perceived throughout the bunker intensified. The room was dominated by a compact, silent machine, the source of all power. A digital display on its side read, "1." Below it, another screen detailed power consumption. For the past 7 years, the facility had been in a state of near-total hibernation, drawing only minimal power to maintain climate control and keep the core computer systems on standby. The moment Kaiser had activated the entrance, the system had surged to life, bringing every circuit and light in the facility to full operational capacity. He observed the deep well water pump, the military-grade air filtration system with its chemical and biological filters, and the hardened servers. This fortress could withstand anything. It had been built to endure the end of the world, and Leo had repurposed it for his own clandestine conflict. However, as he cross-referenced Leo's newly created digital layouts with the original Cold War blueprints, Jake detected a discrepancy. In the main chamber, behind the wall containing the kitchenette, the original plans indicated solid bedrock. Leo's plans revealed a hollow space, a hidden chamber. He returned to the main room, Kaiser observing him with intelligent eyes. He ran his hands along the smooth metallic wall panels behind the small counter. They were seamless, cold to the touch. But in the corner, almost perfectly concealed in the shadows, he found a tiny, nearly invisible indentation. He pressed it. A soft click sounded, and a section of the wall slid open with the same silent hydraulic hiss as the main entrance, revealing a dark, narrow chamber beyond. As the lights automatically illuminated, Jake's breath hitched. This was the armory. It wasn't merely a collection of firearms. It was a declaration of intent. Mounted on the far wall, displayed prominently, was a BCM Recce 16 rifle. It was a soldier's weapon, perfectly configured. A Trigicon ACOG optic sat atop the rail, offering lethal accuracy at any range. A sleek black suppressor was affixed to the barrel, a tool for a phantom. A tactical light and laser module was mounted on its side. It felt like an extension of a warrior's resolve, and rested in Jake's hands as familiarly as his own pulse. Beneath it, arranged within custom-cut foam, lay a Sig Sauer P2226 pistol, a dozen fully loaded magazines for both firearms, and a combat knife. Upon shelves nearby were 2 sets of body armor, a comprehensive trauma kit, advanced night vision goggles, and encrypted radios. This was more than just an armory. It was a declaration. Leo had not merely left him weaponry. He had bequeathed him their shared instruments of trade, prepared with a professional's meticulousness and a brother's deep understanding. He had foreseen this juncture, this ceremonial handover. He understood that if the truth were ever to be revealed, it would necessitate protection by force of arms. Jake lifted the rifle. Its weight was ideal, its balance a long-forgotten companion. He operated the action. The movement was fluid and precise. The cold steel felt more palpable than anything he had encountered in 7 years. The broken individual who had followed a canine into a snowstorm was no more. The veteran who had received a foreclosure notice had been consumed by the fireplace's flames. In his stead stood a soldier, fueled by a righteous anger and a mission bequeathed from beyond the grave. He worked the charging handle, its sharp metallic click resonating within the silent stronghold. It was the sound of a vow being made. He glanced down at Kaiser, who had risen and stood beside him, a silent guardian. The stronghold was secure. The legacy was comprehended. The conflict had just commenced. Several days transpired amid the quiet thrum of the stronghold. Outside, the blizzard had expended its wrath, yielding to a world of immaculate, hushed white beneath a crisp, clear sun. Within, a metamorphosis was underway. The gaunt, troubled recluse was methodically being dismantled, supplanted by the soldier he once was. Jake had utilized the Spartan bathroom to shave away the thick, unkempt beard, exposing the firm, resolute jawline beneath. He had trimmed his hair. His movements were no longer listless with despair, but sharp and effective. The cabin had served as a tomb. This bunker was a crucible, incinerating the weaknesses of the past 7 years and reforging the man within. He had dedicated every waking hour at the computer terminal, absorbing the vast quantities of information Leo had amassed. He familiarized himself with the corporate structures, the names, the timelines. He possessed a clear perception of the conspiracy, yet it was a tableau constructed from circumstantial evidence, financial records, redacted mission logs, and Leo's own speculative audio notes. He had the indicia, but not the definitive proof. The definitive proof, he knew, was sequestered within a singular, formidable encrypted file container on the primary server. It bore a name reflecting Leo's characteristic dramatic flair: Valhalla. For 2 days, Jake had deployed every decryption tool at his disposal against it, but the file remained sealed, an impenetrable digital fortress. It was secured by a caliber of military-grade encryption he had never before encountered. Frustrated, he began to search for a key, a hint, anything Leo might have left behind. He scoured the server, delving into concealed partitions and system files. He ultimately discovered a solitary password-protected text file titled Breadcrumbs. The password prompt posed a question only he could answer. The ridge at Koringal. A faint memory surfaced. A firefight in 2012. Trapped, out of ammunition. Leo providing suppressive fire with a machine gun, drawing the enemy's focus while Jake scrambled to safety. The name of the ridge they had defended against overwhelming odds. He typed it in. Shepherd's Hill. The file opened. It was a message from Leo. Jake, if you are reading this, you have reached the final threshold. Valhalla encompasses everything, all that you require, the entirety, unredacted, the irrefutable evidence, the confession, the kill order. However, the encryption is formidable. It comprises a 2-part key. The initial segment is integrated within this system. The subsequent component, the ultimate key, must be requisitioned from an old, decommissioned military archival server. It is a phantom server, technically offline, yet they maintain its operation. The key is linked to my former service number. Herein lies the predicament. This is the trap. I am nearly convinced that Apex has established a tripwire on that server, a silent alert tied to that specific key. They could not erase the military's deep archives, but they could monitor them. Initiating the request is the sole method to unlock the file, but doing so will generate a minuscule digital trace, a whisper in the darkness. I am wagering that they are still attentive to that whisper. It is a gamble, my brother. The instant you access that file, the countdown commences. They will know someone possesses my legacy, and they will pursue you, but it is the only recourse. Good fortune, Leo. Jake leaned back, the words lingering in the silent atmosphere. For 7 years he had existed as an apparition, his principal objective to remain unseen. Now he was being compelled to ignite a beacon, to deliberately announce his presence to the very malevolence that had slain his closest comrade. Concealment had been his shield. This message instructed him to discard it and grasp a sword. He entered the armory, the cool air of the concealed space embracing him. He gazed at the BCM rifle mounted on the wall. He observed Kaiser, who had followed him and now sat watching, his head tilted as if grasping the gravity of the moment. The dog was the living embodiment of Leo's strategy. A strategy that did not entail perpetual evasion. It was a plan of action, of confrontation, of justice. The deliberation was brief. There was no genuine alternative. To leave the file encrypted would render Leo's sacrifice in vain. It would signify Apex's victory. He had not journeyed this far to retreat back into the shadows. He returned to the terminal. He spent the subsequent hour preparing, constructing a series of digital fortifications around himself. He configured the bunker system to channel the connection request through a succession of encrypted proxies, bouncing the signal across the globe from servers in Iceland to Singapore to Brazil. It would not render him invisible, but it would transform him into a phantom. A fleeting data signature, elusive to pinpoint. With a profound inhalation, he initiated the sequence. Command lines cascaded across the screen. For the first time since his arrival, the bunker was linked to the external world. The request was dispatched. A few moments of agonizing silence elapsed. Then, a new line of code materialized. Key received. He immediately severed the connection. The entire procedure had transpired in under 15 seconds. He applied the new key to the Valhalla file. A progress bar appeared on the screen, and this time, it began to fill. Decryption complete. A new directory opened, and its contents flooded the screen. Unredacted mission orders with falsified threat assessments signed by an Apex executive. Audio recordings of telephone conversations. The voices of men devoid of conscience, discussing casualty figures as if they were stock prices. Satellite imagery depicting Apex hardware being delivered to insurgent strongholds. It was all present. Undeniable. Complete. He possessed it. He had the evidence. Hundreds of miles distant, in a sophisticated glass-walled office atop a skyscraper in Reston, Virginia, a man stood gazing out at the sprawling metropolis below. Elias Thorne was a figure sculpted from ice and ambition. In his late 40s, he wore a tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than Jake's entire cabin. Not a single strand of gray marred his impeccably coiffed silver-black hair. He possessed a handsome, severely predatory appearance, his face defined by sharp angles and cold, intelligent eyes. Formerly a colonel in Army intelligence, he had long ago exchanged his uniform for the considerably more lucrative armor of corporate power. He was the chief of security for Apex Solutions, and he managed it with the same ruthless efficiency he had once employed to direct covert operations. A subtle chime sounded at his door. A young, visibly nervous analyst entered, holding a tablet. "Sir," the analyst began, his voice strained, "we have a flag from the old Cerberus system." Elias turned slowly, his expression an unreadable facade. "Cerberus has been dormant for years." "Yes, sir." That is why it is a red flag. A request was made to the DoD archival server for a very specific decryption key, one linked to the service record of a deceased asset, an analyst named Leo Vance. Elias's expression remained unchanged, but a dangerous stillness enveloped him. Vance, that was the incident in Kunar Province, 2018. Yes, sir. The signal was heavily masked, routed across the globe, but we managed to isolate a probable origin point, a remote, sparsely populated sector, the Cascade Mountains, Oregon. Elias Thorne allowed a faint, cold smile to grace his lips. He had always anticipated this day might arrive. He had pondered for 7 years the fate of Vance's unrecovered work. He had presumed it lost forever in the chaos of that ambush. He had been mistaken. He turned to a large holographic map of the United States on his wall and zoomed in on the highlighted region in Oregon. A ghost had finally materialized. Quote. Elias commanded, his voice a low, chilling directive. Quote. 1. He paused, his cold eyes fixed intently on the map. The moment the evidence was unlocked, the atmosphere within the bunker shifted. The quiet hum of the servers, once a sound of sanctuary, now felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. Jake knew he had initiated a conflict. He had disturbed a nest of hornets, and the swarm was approaching. There was no apprehension, only a cold, sharp clarity that had been absent from his life for 7 long years. He was no longer a man adrift in the past. He was a soldier with a defined objective, confronting a tangible threat. He dedicated the initial hour to transferring the entirety of the Valhalla file onto a hardened military-grade data chip. He worked with a swiftness and accuracy that felt like a long-lost dialect resurfacing to his lips. His hands moved with certainty across the keyboard, encoding the chip with his private cipher. He was establishing a secondary defense, ensuring Leo's lasting impact could endure even if the stronghold was compromised. As he concluded, a serene, synthesized female voice, remarkably distinct, resonated through the chamber. Proximity alert. Unidentified aerial vehicle detected. Sector 7. Altitude 500 meters and descending. Jake's head abruptly elevated. On one of the secondary displays, a topographic representation of the encompassing mountains illuminated. A solitary crimson dot, signifying the drone, slowly orbited the vicinity of the cliff's face. They were conducting reconnaissance. The pursuit had commenced. An unusual sense of peace enveloped him. The apprehension that had been his constant companion for years, the inherent dread of nightmares and recollections, dissipated. This was dissimilar. This was an adversary he could perceive, a peril he could confront. For 7 years, he had been tormented by phantoms he could not grasp. Now the specters were dispatching men armed, and that was a language Jake comprehended completely. He proceeded to the concealed armory, his movements confident and unfaltering. He shed his worn flannel shirt and donned a dark thermal base layer, followed by the lightweight plate carrier. He tightened the straps securely, the familiar compression a reassuring embrace. He secured the Sig Sauer pistol in its holster, inserting a spare magazine into a pouch on the vest. He retrieved the BCM rifle, the cool, unyielding reality of the firearm serving as a definitive affirmation of his renewed objective. He was no longer evading. He was making ready for combat. He returned to the primary console, intending to engage the bunker's defensive mechanisms. He examined the interface, seeking the appropriate commands. He located schematics, power distribution networks, and life support systems, but nothing designated as defense or tactical. Leo, the master of concealment, had hidden it more deeply. As if sensing his vexation, Kaiser stirred from his position on the floor. The aging canine moved with a silent purpose towards an apparently unmarked section of the wall adjacent to the main server array. He pressed a specific, nearly imperceptible panel with his snout. With a subtle chime, the primary display before Jake shimmered, the directory of files supplanted by a breathtaking 3-dimensional holographic projection of the mountainside. The crimson marker of the drone was clearly discernible, but now dozens of emerald icons were also scattered across the landscape. Jake gazed in admiration. He was observing the fortress's central nervous system. He identified the icons for the perimeter motion sensors, the seismic detectors, and most crucially, a potent wide-area signal jammer. He discovered the command to activate it. And a moment later, the drone's crimson dot on the map began to blink before transforming to gray. Signal lost. The screen registered. He had rendered their aerial scout blind. But Kaiser was not yet finished. The dog ambled over to a particular floor tile, one that appeared identical to all the others. He tapped it twice with his paw. A portion of the floor slid open, revealing a recessed compartment. Within lay a small panel adorned with a series of switches and remote activators. A diagram affixed to the inside of the lid indicated their connection to a series of non-lethal countermeasures Leo had integrated into the surrounding environment. Concussive charges designed to disorient, concealed netting, and high-intensity strobe emitters. The dog then trotted down the primary utility corridor, halting at what Jake had presumed to be an impasse. He nudged a substantial insulated water pipe with his head. With a hiss of hydraulics, the entire wall section retracted, exposing a narrow, dark passage that sloped sharply downward. It was an egress tunnel, a sanctuary, one of innumerable hidden features this location still contained. Jake followed the dog back to the central chamber, his mind awash with the sheer ingenuity of his companion's preparations. Leo had not merely constructed a stronghold. He had devised a fully integrated weapon system, and he had designated his most trusted, steadfast companion as its living key. He sat on the edge of the bunk, the rifle resting across his lap. Kaiser approached him, resting his heavy head on Jake's knee. Jake looked down into those intelligent amber eyes, and at last broke the silence. "He truly considered everything, didn't he, boy?" he inquired, his voice heavy with emotion. He caressed the dog's broad head, his fingers tracing the old scars concealed within the thick fur. He knew. He knew they were coming for him, and yet he walked directly into it. The bravest man I have ever encountered. He reflected on the numerous occasions they had depended on one another, the unspoken confidence that had preserved their lives in insurmountable circumstances, and he realized that Leo's final act represented the ultimate manifestation of that trust. He had believed Jake would comprehend. He had entrusted Kaiser to be his envoy, and he had relied on them jointly to conclude the conflict he had initiated. "He has bequeathed this struggle to us, Kaiser," Jake whispered, leaning his head back against the cold wall. "It is merely you and I henceforth. We are all that remains of the unit." In that instant, the bond between them solidified into something indissoluble. It was no longer a man and an animal. It was two combatants in the same trench, united by a shared fidelity to a fallen commander. It was a pact, a solemn vow made to the specter of Leo Vance to see his directive fulfilled to its conclusion. The chamber was punctuated by a new alert, drawing Jake from his reflections. Multiple ground signatures detected 5 kilometers distant and rapidly approaching. Jake stood, the rifle feeling light in his grasp. He moved towards the holographic map, Kaiser by his side. Several crimson icons were now progressing steadily towards their location, a pack of wolves closing in on their quarry. They were arriving. Jake looked down at Kaiser, who gazed back up at him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. They were outnumbered. They were outmatched by weaponry. They were confined within a sepulchre miles from civilization. And for the first time in 7 years, Jake Thorne felt unequivocally alive. He and his partner were prepared. The holographic map presented a silent, 3-dimensional battlefield. The crimson icons, representative of Thorne's mercenaries, advanced with a menacing, predatory grace, fanning out from their deployment point to form a flawless closing circle around the cliff face. They were not a disorganized rabble. They were a pack of wolves, professional and disciplined, employing textbook sweep and clear formations. Jake observed their methodical progression, a cold knot of respect tightening in his gut. These were not second-rate thugs. They were Tier 1 operators, the caliber of men with whom he himself had once fought. Apex Solutions had dispatched its finest. He witnessed them pause, attempting to deploy smaller tactical drones to gain an aerial perspective of the terrain, but the bunker's potent signal jammer filled the air with a tempest of static. On the map, their communication signals appeared as faint, frustrated flickers that expired mere inches from their origin. They were rendered deaf and blind, reduced to using hand signals for tactical coordination. It was a testament to Leo's foresight, a formidable initial line of defense that had afforded Jake invaluable time. However, the map, while beneficial, solely indicated positions. Jake required ground reconnaissance. He needed to observe his adversaries to scrutinize their equipment, their numerical strength, their demeanor. He scanned the primary console, his fingers dancing across the interface, searching for camera controls. He located the system but found it was locked, protected by an additional stratum of Leo's infuriatingly brilliant security protocols. He attempted several override codes, his frustration escalating. He could discern the enemy encircling his tomb, but could not visually confirm their presence. Kaiser, who had been seated serenely beside him, seemed to perceive the shift in Jake's mood. The dog rose, stretched his formidable frame, and ambled towards the far wall of the command center. Embedded within the smooth metallic surface was a series of decorative stone slabs, each bearing the distinct impression of a fossil. One at the very bottom contained the exquisite swirling pattern of an ammonite. It was the sort of distinctive detail Leo would have appreciated. Kaiser sniffed at the ammonite fossil, then glanced back at Jake. He lifted his right paw and pressed it firmly into the center of the fossil's spiral. The principal monitor before Jake immediately flickered, the holographic map replaced by a grid of 16 high-definition video feeds. His breath hitched. The images were perfectly clear, broadcast from minuscule, ingeniously concealed micro-cameras embedded within pine cones, behind fragments of bark, and within crevices in the rock. He possessed a complete 360-degree view of the entire perimeter. He could perceive them now, 8 individuals moving with the quiet, lethal efficiency of men who were masters of their craft. They were attired in black, state-of-the-art tactical gear, wielding suppressed carbines. They swept the area, their movements economical, their gazes perpetually scanning for any indication of a disturbance in the snow, any hint of a concealed entry. Yet, they discovered nothing. Leo's camouflage was impeccable. The fortress remained an apparition. As he observed, the calm, synthesized voice of the bunker's AI spoke once more. Alert, hostile energy surge detected, counter-frequency electronic warfare active, attempting to bypass jamming protocols. On an auxiliary monitor, a power grid schematic began to flash with red warnings. A massive brute-force electronic assault was being directed at them. An endeavor to overwhelm the jammer. The geothermal generator's output spiked precariously. System overload. Imminent. A message flashed in bold red letters. The lights within the bunker flickered. Jake's heart pounded against his ribs. He plunged back into the console, searching for power management controls, a method to redirect energy from non-essential systems to bolster the jammer's output. But everything was inaccessible, automated. The system was engineered to be self-governing, and it was losing the engagement. Just as a system-wide failure alarm began to blare, Kaiser acted again. He surged toward a utility panel located low on the wall, an area Jake had presumed to be a basic junction box. The dog used his snout to open the modest cover, revealing a collection of bundled wires and conduits. Concealed deeply within was a small, recessed lever, scarcely visible to the human eye. With a precise and calculated movement, Kaiser nudged the lever sideways with the edge of his muzzle. Immediately, the piercing alarm ceased. The bunker's lights stabilized. On the power grid monitor, Jake observed with astonishment as a new schematic materialized. A secondary auxiliary power system, previously unknown to him, activated. Its energy flowed directly into the signal jammer, fortifying it. The hostile energy surge was thwarted, and the system, now more robust than before, achieved stability. Jake reclined in his chair, releasing a prolonged exhalation. He looked at the dog, who had returned to his side as if nothing untoward had occurred. He was truly astonished. Leo had not merely trained Kaiser, he had integrated him into the very infrastructure of the fortress. The canine was a biomechanical key, a living, responsive interface for the bunker's most vital functions. He constituted a security measure impervious to hacking, a guardian privy to the secrets of the machinery he was tasked with safeguarding. Jake reached down, placing his hand on Kaiser's head. It was a silent gesture of deep admiration. With the immediate peril averted, they resumed observing the adversaries. Jake watched the mercenaries reassemble. Their leader, a commanding figure whose visage was obscured by a helmet and goggles, received a report from a subordinate who gestured angrily at his own silent earpiece. Their frustration was evident. They were positioned directly atop their objective, yet they were entirely unaware and unable to communicate with it. They were pursuing a phantom and were rapidly comprehending that they themselves were ensnared in darkness. Jake experienced a grim sense of satisfaction. Leo had not simply erected a shield, he had forged a weapon that transformed the enemy's technological superiority into a debilitating vulnerability. The mercenary leader stood for an extended period, his stance radiating controlled indignation. He then conveyed a series of sharp, decisive hand signals. The unit ceased its fruitless search. They commenced unloading heavy packs from their shoulders, retrieving equipment that was considerably more rudimentary and decidedly more hazardous. Jake recognized the components instantly: seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar units, and drilling apparatus. Their high-tech reconnaissance had proven fruitless. Now they were preparing to excavate the mountain section by section in pursuit of the concealed asset. The covert conflict of signals had concluded. The physical assault was imminent. The atmosphere within the command center was taut with a silent, escalating tension. The war of signals had been won, but Jake understood it was merely a preliminary triumph. On the multi-panel display, he observed the 8 mercenaries operating with a disquieting, detached efficiency. They were no longer searching haphazardly. They had transitioned to a new, far more perilous phase. Under the direction of their unseen commander, they established a meticulous grid pattern in the snow-covered woodland before the cliff face. 2 individuals began systematically surveying this grid with a device resembling a sophisticated pushcart. Jake identified it immediately: ground-penetrating radar, GPR. They were no longer seeking an entrance. They were mapping the very earth, searching for any artificial void, any unoccupied space that deviated from the norm. Concurrently, other team members deployed a series of small, spiked sensors, driving them deep into the frozen terrain, seismic detectors. They were constructing a detailed subterranean map, and with each passing minute, their digital representation of the world beneath their feet became progressively clearer. Jake observed a real-time rendition of their scan on his own holographic map. He witnessed the GPR signal gradually rendering an image of the rock and soil. It was merely a matter of time, perhaps an hour or 2, before the substantial man-made anomaly of the bunker appeared on their screens, as distinctly as a malignancy on an X-ray. The fortress's walls, once a symbol of security, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. He was being cornered not by individuals, but by methodical, inescapable technology. To delay was to perish. To maintain a defensive posture was to concede the battle. Leo had provided him with a fortress, yet a fortress was inconsequential without a soldier prepared to venture beyond its confines. The decision was not born of apprehension, but of cold, unyielding tactical pragmatism. He had to mount a counterattack. He had to disrupt their operation to shatter their concentration, to remind them that the phantom they pursued possessed formidable capabilities. He moved with a fluid, revitalized resolve. He donned the insulated parka over his body armor. He slung the BCM rifle over his shoulder and secured a small pack containing a few remote activators for the non-lethal traps, a pair of binoculars, and spare magazines. He was departing the command center and re-entering the fray. He turned to Kaiser, who observed his preparations with an unwavering gaze. The dog emitted a low sound of concern and understanding. Jake knelt, meeting the old dog's gaze directly. "I'll be back," he stated, his voice low and firm. "You have the watch. Guard this place, boy. You guard R6. It was a command, not a suggestion. Kaiser responded not with a bark, but with a calm, determined stillness. He sat, his posture alert, his eyes fixed on the monitors. He comprehended his obligation. He was the keeper of the fortress. Jake gave him one final firm pat on the head before turning, vanishing into the narrow, concealed passage that descended into the mountain's subterranean depths. The air within the tunnel was frigid and carried the scent of damp stone and ancient earth. It was a tight passage with the pack, compelling him to move sideways, one hand gripping the cold, rough wall. The passage sloped downward for what seemed like 100 yards before opening onto a small, slippery ledge. Below him lay a scene from a forgotten era. A subterranean stream, its water as black and lustrous as obsidian, flowed silently through a natural cavern. The sole audible sounds were the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from stalactites high above. This was the ingenuity of Leo's design. No GPR or seismic sensor could effectively map what lay beneath a moving body of water. It represented the ideal flaw in their technological web. There was no time for hesitation. Holding his rifle aloft, Jake took a deep breath and stepped off the ledge. The shock of the icy water was a physical jolt. It stole his breath and sent 1,000 needles of cold into his skin. For a moment, his muscles seized, but his training and adrenaline took over. He kicked off the bottom, submerging himself entirely in the crushing, silent darkness. He swam with the current, his eyes open, yet seeing nothing, navigating by touch and a recollection of the schematics. The passage was brief, perhaps only 30 feet. Yet, in the breathless, freezing dark, it felt like an eternity. Just as his lungs began to burn with a desperate intensity, his outstretched hand brushed against the rough texture of a rock face. He felt for a handhold and pulled himself upward, his head breaking the surface with a loud, gasping breath. He had emerged in a small, hidden grotto, a collapsed ice cave concealed behind a frozen waterfall, a good 200 yards from the main cliff face and well beyond the mercenaries' search grid. He was drenched, freezing, and utterly alive. He was a phantom risen from the mountain's core. He hauled himself out of the water, his body trembling uncontrollably from the cold. He moved swiftly, forcing his numb muscles to function, understanding that to remain stationary was to succumb to hypothermia. He found a sheltered spot amidst a dense cluster of ferns, an elevated position that afforded him a clear vantage point of the enemy's location. He stripped off the wet parka. His body armor had kept his core mostly dry, and he allowed the biting wind to begin its work of freezing the outer layers of his clothing. Through his binoculars, the scene below was chillingly distinct. He could see the mercenaries, their movements unhurried and confident. They were completely unaware, entirely focused on their technological pursuit. They believed their objective to be a rat in a cage, passively awaiting their subterranean excavation. They had no inkling that the rat had slipped out through the rear, and was now observing them from the shadows, a wolf among the trees. Jake's gaze swept across the tableau, not as a man in concealment, but as a predator scrutinizing its prey. His eyes passed over the soldiers and fixed upon their equipment. He observed the GPR unit, the seismic sensors, and tucked away near their command post, a small portable generator hummed softly, its exhaust a faint plume in the cold air. It was the core of their operation, the power source for the very technology that threatened to expose him. That was his target. He settled into position, the snow providing a cold cushion beneath him. He deployed the rifle's bipod, pressing it firmly into the snowpack to establish a stable firing platform. He assessed the wind, a gentle drift from left to right. He adjusted his aim, his breathing slowing until it was a barely discernible cloud in the frigid air. The world narrowed to the view through his scope. The crosshairs settled on the humming generator. He was no longer fleeing. He was no longer in hiding. The race against time had now become a hunt, and he was about to announce his presence on his own terms. The world viewed through the rifle scope was a cold, clinical environment. Jake's breathing was a soft, steady cadence. His heartbeat a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was no longer an individual. He was an instrument of purpose, an extension of the cold steel he held in his hands. The crosshairs remained steady on the humming generator, the heart of the enemy's operation. He exhaled, and in the interval between heartbeats, he squeezed the trigger. The BCM rifle bucked gently against his shoulder, the suppressor reducing the sound of the shot to a dull, heavy cough that was swallowed by the vast, snowy forest. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then a small dark hole appeared on the generator's casing. A shower of sparks erupted, and with a pathetic whining groan, the machine died. Down below, the lights on the mercenaries' advanced equipment flickered and went dark. The screen of the GPR unit went black. The low hum of their technology was replaced by the natural, unnerving silence of the wilderness. For a moment, the 8 men stood in confused stillness. Then their training kicked in. They fanned out, taking cover behind trees, their rifles raised, scanning the silent woods. But they were looking for a muzzle flash, listening for a thunderous report. They were hunting a conventional soldier. Jake was something else entirely. He was already gone. Before the echo of his shot had faded, he had retracted the rifle's bipod and melted back into the trees, his movements swift and silent. He used his intimate knowledge of the forest, the game trails, and hidden hollows he had explored during his 7 years of exile to circle their position. He moved like a ghost, his boots barely disturbing the snow. From a new vantage point on the opposite side of their perimeter, he took aim again. This time, his target was the delicate sensor array of the GPR unit itself. Another suppressed shot, another precise impact. The high-tech lens shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Their eyes were now permanently blind. Chaos began to ripple through their ranks. The leader was shouting commands, but with their comms jammed and their equipment dead, his voice was swallowed by the trees. They were disconnected, isolated. Jake began to use suppressive fire, not to kill, but to herd them. He fired rounds into the thick branches above their heads, sending showers of bark and snow raining down. He sent a round into a snowbank just to their left, then another into a tree trunk to their right. The suppressed shots were phantoms. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. The mercenaries, unable to locate a single point of origin, became pinned down, their confidence eroding with every invisible shot. They were a pack of wolves, but they were being hunted by a whisper. Jake pulled one of the small remote activators from his pack. He had studied the map of Leo's traps for hours, memorizing their locations. He pressed a button 100 yards from his position near a cluster of 3 mercenaries. A buried concussive charge detonated with a deep, earth-shaking thump. It wasn't lethal, but the blast of pure sound and pressure sent the 3 men sprawling, their ears ringing, their senses scrambled. The psychological toll was immense. Their advanced technology was useless. They were being systematically dismantled by an unseen force. The forest itself had become their enemy. Their discipline began to fray, replaced by a primal, creeping fear. This was the moment Jake had been waiting for. After sowing chaos, he created an illusion of order. He deliberately fired a few shots from a single position, then made a show of retreating back towards a narrow, rocky canyon. He made his tracks obvious. His withdrawal looked like the desperate flight of a man on the run. From his concealed position, the mercenary leader saw it. He saw the tracks, the clear path of retreat. Arrogant and furious at being made to look like an amateur, he saw it as an opportunity to finally corner his prey. "He's running," he yelled to the men closest to him. "Omega 1-2 with me. The rest of you hold this perimeter." He had taken the bait. Elias Thorne, accompanied by his 2 best operators, charged after the ghost, right into the jaws of the trap. The canyon was a natural choke point, its high granite walls providing no cover and only one way forward. Jake was waiting, perched high above on a narrow hidden ledge. As Thorn and his 2 men entered the canyon, Jake raised his rifle one more time. His target was not a man, but the weapon in Thorn's hands. Another soft cough from the suppressor. The bullet crossed the canyon in an instant and struck Thorn's rifle with a violent crack of metal on metal. The weapon was torn from his grasp, its receiver shattered and useless. Before his 2 men could even react, Jake revealed himself, stepping to the edge of the ledge. "That's far enough," he called down, his voice a low, guttural rasp, unused to speaking. It was the voice of a man who had been silent for too long. Thorn stared up, his face now visible without his helmet, a mask of pure shock and fury. "Thorn," Jake said, the name an accusation. "You came a long way for what was his. You're not leaving with it." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Thorn snarled, his corporate polish stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "I know exactly who you are," Jake replied, his voice flat and cold. "You're the man who murdered Leo Vance." With a roar of fury, Thorn lunged not at Jake, but at the rock face, beginning to climb with a surprising, desperate agility. His men raised their rifles, but before they could fire, a deep, menacing growl echoed through the canyon. From a dark crevice near the canyon floor, the exit of another of the bunker's secret tunnels, a gray and white blur erupted. Kaiser. The dog moved with the speed and precision of a guided missile. He did not go for the 2 soldiers. His target was the leader. He launched himself through the air, hitting Thorn in the center of his chest with the force of a battering ram. The 2 of them crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Thorn, dazed, reached for a combat knife strapped to his vest. But Kaiser was faster. The dog's powerful jaws clamped down on Thorn's right arm, the pressure immense. There was no savage tearing, only a controlled, immobilizing force. Thorn cried out in pain and rage, his fingers uncurling as the knife clattered onto the rocks. Kaiser held him there, a low, rumbling growl his only sound, his eyes fixed on the threat. He was the perfect guardian, the final living piece of Leo's plan, executing his last command, protect the successor. The 2 other mercenaries stood frozen, their rifles half raised, unsure whether to shoot the man on the ledge or the dog on their commander. It was over. Jake slid down from the ledge, his rifle held at a low ready. He stood over his defeated enemy, the man who had haunted his every waking moment for 7 years. The air was still and cold. The only sounds the ragged breathing of the men and the low, steady growl from the loyal dog at his feet. He was the inheritor, and with his guardian beside him, he had just claimed his legacy. The canyon was silent in the aftermath of the battle. The remaining 5 mercenaries, hearing the confrontation and seeing their leader fall, had surrendered without another shot fired. They were soldiers, not fanatics, and they knew when a fight was lost. Jake, moving with a detached efficiency, disarmed them and secured them using their own zip ties, leaving them for the authorities that would inevitably be called to this remote corner of the mountains. His fight with them was over. He returned to the bunker with Kaiser, the weight of victory feeling heavier than he had imagined. The fight was won, but the war was not. Justice for Leo was not yet complete. He knew there had to be one final step, one last directive from his friend. He sat at the console and found a single, final encrypted file in the main directory. A file that had only become visible after the Valhalla container was opened. It was named Protocol. The password prompt was simple. "Who's a good boy?" Jake looked down at the loyal dog sitting at his feet and typed in the only possible answer. Kaiser. The file opened. It was Leo's final letter. It was brief and to the point. The first part was the contact information for a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Leo's notes described her as a relentless investigative journalist who had a reputation for taking on powerful corporations and corrupt government agencies. She was fearless, trusted no one, and most importantly, could not be bought. A secure encrypted messaging channel was provided. The second part was a string of codes and keys for a cryptocurrency wallet. A simple note followed. For your fresh start, brother, don't argue. You've earned it. It was a final gift, a final act of a friendship that had transcended even death. Using the bunker's secure satellite array for the last time, Jake sent a single anonymous message to Sarah Jenkins. I have irrefutable proof of treason by Apex Solutions, including illegal arms sales and the targeted killing of U.S. military personnel. I also have their chief of security, Elias Thorne, and his strike team in custody. The enclosed data chip contains the full, unredacted evidence. Do what you do best. He attached the coordinates to a dead drop location deep in the forest, miles away, and hit send. Then he severed the connection for good. He spent the next few days in the quiet hum of the fortress, watching the world from the safety of his underground haven. He watched as local law enforcement, guided by an anonymous tip, found and arrested Thorne and his stunned, frostbitten team. Then a week later, the storm broke. It started as a single explosive article by Sarah Jenkins published online. Within hours, it was the biggest news story in the world. The headlines were a torrent of outrage and disbelief. Apex betrayal, defense giant accused of treason, Pentagon rocked by murder-for-profit scandal, the hero who died to expose it all, the story of Leo Vance. Jake watched news feeds showing federal agents raiding the gleaming Virginia headquarters of Apex Solutions. He saw the CEO, a man he had only seen in audio logs, being led away in handcuffs. The whole company, this web of deceit and avarice, collapsed spectacularly in a firestorm of justice. Leo's name was vindicated. His sacrifice was imbued with purpose. He was no longer a victim, he was celebrated as a hero. The operation was concluded. It was now time for them to vanish. Adhering to Leo's final directive, Jake proceeded to the utility section. He located the control for the scuttling sequence. It was not a destructive self-annihilation, but a methodical deactivation intended to render the facility unusable permanently. He initiated the process. A serene, synthesized voice announced, "Scuttling sequence activated. Full system collapse in 60 minutes." He returned to the command center and commenced the final data erasure, purging the servers, obliterating every vestige of evidence and his own digital footprint. The server rack's green and amber indicators extinguished one by one until the fort's humming core fell silent. With Kaiser by his flank, he took a final perambulation through the complex. He passed the vacant bunks, the quiet armory, and the darkened command center. This place had been his trial by fire, the very spot where he had been broken down and subsequently reconstructed. It had constituted Leo's ultimate bequest, serving as both his shield and his weapon. Its utility had been fulfilled. He packed his modest belongings into his worn rucksack. He fastened a simple leather leash to Kaiser's paracord collar. Together, they descended the corridor for the last time. The immense metal portal glided open, revealing a world cleansed, the brilliant sun shimmering on the fresh snow. They stepped out into the sharp, cold atmosphere. Behind them, the door hissed shut, its final closure. A profound grinding resonance emanated from the mountain's core, the sound of retracting supports, of failing mechanisms, of a stronghold yielding its secrets to the stone. A small controlled rock slide, orchestrated by Leo, tumbled down the cliff face, concealing the entrance beneath tons of granite. Within minutes, it was as if it had never existed. The mountain once again held its confidences. The sun was just beginning to ascend above the distant horizon, casting the undersides of the clouds in hues of fiery orange and delicate pink. An aged, battered pickup truck, one Leo had arranged to be left for him at a storage facility in town, rumbled along a nondescript two-lane highway, heading eastward. Jake was at the wheel, his hands resting casually. The windows were down, and the cool morning air swept through the cabin, carrying the fragrance of pine and moist earth. In the passenger seat, Kaiser sat regally, his head out the window, his ears flapping in the breeze, a look of unadulterated, simple delight upon his features. The rage that had propelled Jake for the preceding weeks had dissipated. The sorrow that had been his constant companion for 7 years had receded. He felt a stillness, an emptiness, but not an unwelcome one. It was a pristine, tranquil void, a blank canvas awaiting a new narrative. He was not contemplating the cryptocurrency in his wallet, or the men now languishing in federal penitentiaries. He was not considering what lay ahead, or the eventual destination of this road. For the first time, he was simply present, feeling the subtle vibration of the engine, observing the nascent light of a new day unfurl across the landscape. He glanced at Kaiser. The seasoned dog retracted his head and met his gaze, his amber eyes soft and tranquil. In those eyes, Jake perceived the steadfast devotion that had traversed a wilderness to find him, the fierce bravery that had confronted a murderer, and the quiet fellowship that had steadied him through turmoil. And then, for the first time since before that dreadful day in 2018, Jacob Thorne's lips curved into a genuine, unburdened smile. It was a small, understated expression, a gentle upward turn of the mouth. Yet it was as luminous and as filled with promise as the dawning sun. He was liberated. The path forward was uncharted, the ultimate destination undetermined, but it was their road to traverse jointly, embarking on a prolonged journey back to the serene, peaceful existence that had been reclaimed from them, one sunrise after another. It stands as a potent reminder that on occasion, the most profound illumination during our darkest hours emanates from an unwavering loyalty and a love that never truly departs. A promise fulfilled by a devoted friend can be the sole entity to guide us back to the light of day. The connection between a veteran and their canine partner is profoundly special. It is our privilege to share these narratives with you. Should these accounts of valor and recovery resonate with your spirit, we encourage you to become part of our community by subscribing. Your positive reactions, shared content, and thoughtful comments assist these stories of fidelity in reaching the audience they merit. The journey need not conclude here, as another exciting adventure awaits you immediately on the